What's going on, guys? This is Rob. If you guys enjoy my content, make sure you hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit that little bell so you never miss out on my sexy voice. You know, the one thing I hate the most about having the flu is my schedule gets all thrown off. And so it's like, okay, like I am in no condition to record. So whatever videos we have online, those videos are going out. And I don't even care if it matches the schedule or not. Like it's crazy. Like it is rough. But we are finally back on track. We're finally back on our schedule. We're doing our Green Lanterns on Sundays. And again, we're picking up with the Green Lantern line of stories as part of Brightest Day. And I'm actually, I mean, I'm gonna be honest here, guys. I actually like Green Lantern more than I like the main Brightest Day story. Now, a lot of that again is because of the fact that Brightest Day was designed to detail the 12 heroes, 12 villains, or what have you. They came back to life after the events of Blackest Night. But if those are characters that you were never really interested in the first place, the main story probably wouldn't intrigue you that much. And so again, because of the fact that Green Lantern focuses on the Lantern entities, this is where all the world building is. Now remember, we've basically fleshed out a couple things. The first is that Parallax, the Yellow Lantern entity, the entity of the Sinestro Corps, the being that possessed Hal Jordan during the events of Emerald Twilight, that was only the first entity that we knew of, and there were so many others to go over. There was also the entity of the Orange Lantern that was basically, that was essentially possessed by Hector Hammond, who was one of the most notable enemies of Hal Jordan. Now, at the point right now, Hector Hammond is still out there. He's not been captured off panel or anything like that in terms of like Hal Jordan and those guys. He's just still floating around out there. And that's gonna be kind of a focal point of this story to a degree, especially when it comes to the character of Larfleeze. But at this moment, what we actually end up doing here is picking up with a prison in Montana that's effectively just kind of been totally obliterated and destroyed. And the way it's described here is that there was something that was akin to a bull that just kind of ran through this whole thing and tore everything up. That basically just started ripping the prison to pieces and all that kind of good stuff. And where the cops are kind of, trying to figure out what's going on and where they're analyzing the situation and they're talking about how to take it out, what ends up happening is one of them describes it as a being that's made of like fire or something along those lines. And then Atrocitus shows up alongside Sinestro and says, that's because it's not fire, it's pure rage. Now remember, after the events of Blackest Night, what we kind of had were all these leaders of the Lantern Corps who showed up on Earth to fight Nekron, the leader of the Black Lanterns. And following Nekron's defeat, we basically had the White Lantern that showed up. And because the White Lantern was there, what it meant is that everybody was kind of curious about it. At the same time, you had the White Lantern that was essentially like issuing orders to like Hal Jordan and Sinestro and Carol Ferris of the Star Sapphires, and essentially saying, you have to find the entities. And so it was kind of a way to keep the various leaders of the Lantern Corps confined to Earth to kind of keep them there. While some may have strayed, they ultimately came back, and it was designed to basically bring them all together for a singular cause. And that's really where this was. That was really the basis behind this. It's fleshing out all these entities, these beings that are kind of like a representation of the emotional spectrum. Now remember, they're not the sum total of the emotional spectrum. Like the bull is not the sum total of all energy of rage. It's just the representation of rage. It's kind of one of those interesting metaphysical things, but it does serve its purpose because one of the things that happens here is the character of Atrocitus. And this was not necessarily designed to be a kind of rework of his character, which is to say, it wasn't really like turning the character of Atrocitus into a hero. What it was designed to do in a lot of ways was flesh his character out. Now, the reason I say that is, remember, when Atrocitus first showed up in the Green Lantern line of comics, he was just a raging monster in a lot of different ways. And the reason why was because his people had been totally obliterated by the Manhunters, the robots designed by the Guardians of the Universe, who were ultimately decommissioned and replaced with the Green Lanterns to police the universe. But because of that, Atrocitus has always had a hatred for the Guardians of the Universe themselves, but he was almost always driven by like rage and anger. But ever since he learned of the bull, basically the entity that represents rage in the emotional spectrum, he's been constantly seeking after it. And whether it's because of this sort of focal point, which is to say he can kind of channel all of his energies and all of his thoughts into finding this one thing, or if it's because he's been working alongside Hal Jordan and he's worked alongside Sinestro and he's got other Lantern Corps members that he's been working with, for whatever reason, he's experiencing a kind of shift of sorts in the sense that there's basically this bus full of prisoners and he effectively kills them all. He annihilates them all in their entirety. And when the question is asked by Sinestro, why would you do this? Atrocitus' response is because those who would take life don't deserve it. They basically deserve to lose theirs. Individuals who would bring harm or bring pain and suffering to innocent people don't deserve to live. Now, this is kind of funny because this does fit into Atrocitus. It's not like, Jeff Johns took a huge paradigm shift. Atrocitus's motivation, while it was predicated on the loss of his family and his desire is to take out the Guardians and the Green Lanterns, it's not just a desire to kill. But for the most part, he believes he'll bring peace to the universe. That if he eliminates the Guardians of the Universe, if he eliminates the Green Lanterns, these kind of agents for the Guardians' schemes and motivations, motivations with Atrocitus knowing a lot of the things that the Green Lanterns don't. In his mind, he's basically allowing people to live their own lives outside of the invisible and oftentimes subtle control of the Guardians themselves. So he's not really a villain. Now, his actions in terms of attacking Green Lanterns and killing them, things like that could be construed as being villainous depending on how you view the Green Lanterns. And that's something I want you guys to keep in mind, because as we progress throughout Jeff Johns' run, what we're gonna do is we're gonna start to make this shift, this kind of transition between the Green Lanterns being just wholly good guys to where we start to look at the Green Lanterns with a bit of a skewed eye, and especially the Guardians of the Universe, where it's like, are they really the heroes that we always thought they were? But at this point, we switch back to Zamoron. Now remember, in the last video, we had talked about how the entity that represents the Star Sapphires is the Predator. And because all these entities were on Earth, and because all these entities had kind of just escaped, or at least people became aware of their presence following the arrival of the White Lantern, what we basically had is kind of this gold rush for the respective Lantern Corps to track down their entities. And Carol Ferris had effectively come across the Predator and then in turn brought the Predator back to Zamoron. But the idea was that the Central Power Battery kind of ran on the Predator, more or less. But when the Predator had effectively left, when that energy had escaped and the Predator had arrived on Earth, the belief of the Star Sapphires was, well, it's only a matter of time before we use up all the energy in the Central Power Battery. But this is when Carol Ferris came along and said, that's not true. Like every other Lantern Corps that exists out there, the Central Power Battery, the central point by which you guys as Star Sapphires derive your power, that's all based on the emotional aspect of love. And so long as there is love in the universe, there will always be energy in the Star Sapphire Central Power Battery. And so at that point, the question became, what do we do with the Predator? In the dying moments of the former Queen Agapo of the Star Sapphires, she had basically made Carol Ferris the new queen. And so what this means is that Carol Ferris now leads the Star Sapphires. But the idea here is that, again, what seems to be hinting at here is that Carol Ferris may very well bond with the entity itself. That we're not 100% sure about. I mean, at this point, we're not really given an answer. Instead, she just kind of takes off with the entity, and when Hal Jordan says, when are you gonna be back? She says, when the job is done, which of course is the same answer that Hal Jordan always gave Carol whenever he took off. But at this point, we switch over to Michigan, and we basically pick up with a young girl who had effectively just gone missing. It's basically the idea that Nicole had been taken captive by some guy. But it's interesting, because this girl basically says, I forgive you for the things that you've done, and I hope that you forgive me for what I'm about to do, but I've always been told you have to forgive those that do wrong. And that's what's so cool about this, is because she immediately topples this guy, immediately throws soup at him and essentially tries to make her escape and subdue him. But then she's suddenly met by the arrival of Adara, the Blue Lantern entity. And this is cool, because the way this girl talked, when she said, I forgive you for the things that you've done, it's very much Blue Lantern-like, because it's really more about like inner peace, because it's really more about finding a kind of place within yourself where you find a measure of contentment and you find hope. That's exactly what Nicole's found. And of course, she ends up becoming a host for Adara, the Blue Lantern entity. Now, at this point, we switch back over to Larfleeze. And this is where I say, this is where the story kind of begins to emphasize the nature of Larfleeze with regards to Hector Hammond. Remember, when it comes to the various Lantern Corps that are out there, they have a Central Power Battery. And a Central Power Battery is exactly what it sounds like. It's a giant, lantern, more or less, in the color of whatever corps represents. But the idea is that it's kind of like a consolidation factory. All the emotion that belongs to that one particular Lantern Corps is kind of consolidated inside the Central Power Battery. It's sort of funneled into that battery itself, or at least the battery draws on that part of the emotional spectrum. And from there, all that energy is just divvied out among the various lanterns that exist out there. But remember, the amount of energy any one lantern can use is essentially based on how many lanterns are out there. So while there is a lot of energy that's there, one of the things that was established when it came to Larfleeze, the Orange Lantern, is that with the Green Lanterns, you have like 3,600 lanterns that are out there. And so you have all this energy split among 3,600 people. Well, what happens when you have all that energy that goes into one person? That's how it works with Larfleeze. Larfleeze is the Orange Lantern of greed, of avarice. And so instead of having like a huge Central Power Battery that anybody can locate and anybody can tap into, instead, it's just his little battery that he keeps confined to himself, and that Ophidian, the Orange Lantern entity, was confined in. Now, of course, with Hector Hammond consuming that lantern, all that energy is now in him. And what it means is the power of Larfleeze is slowly starting to drain. And this is pretty significant, because as a lantern based on greed, he wants as much as he can possibly have. He's literally just a hoarder. And so because of that, when his lantern power starts to dissipate, it's crushing, because now his self-identity begins to go away. Now, in truth, if the Orange Lantern was removed from Larfleeze for any real measure of time, let's say for like a few weeks or a few months, he would revert back to his normal state. He would no longer be governed by like greed or anything along those lines, or at least that's how I would interpret it. I wouldn't think that would be the case. But regardless of the scenario, with his power effectively waning, he's been tasked with kind of keeping an eye on a guy named Abraham, who is basically the host for the Predator entity when it first popped up on Earth before Carol Ferris took Omega to Zamora. And it is kind of cool here because what we end up finding out is that one, Larfleeze is not the actual name of this guy, and two, his family's still alive and they still miss him to a degree. Now, Larfleeze has for the most part cast off his former identity. He's basically just become the person he is now and almost doesn't want to go back to the person that he was before. But it is kind of cool because when he goes to attack Abraham, of course, Hal Jordan shows up and Hal Jordan says, look, we can't have this. You need to calm down. You need to chill. We're here to protect this guy for, whatever reason, whatever the motivation is. But in the middle of this conflict they're having, they're suddenly met by the arrival of St. Walker, or at least by a message from St. Walker. Now, the funny thing about this is St. Walker basically grabs him and says, Adara has arrived. Adara has chosen a host. Now remember, when it comes to a person becoming a Blue Lantern, that's not something that's just readily done. It's a huge trial. You're put through all these trials and all these tribulations and they hardcore test your mettle. That's why you don't have 3,600 Blue Lanterns running around. At most you have 5. But the fact that Adara has chosen a host is very interesting because Adara is kind of designed to be this sort of harbinger for how it is the Blue Lanterns choose. And so if Adara has chosen a host, it means Adara has essentially searched throughout all however many billions of people on Earth and settled on one person, the person best suited to instill hope in others. Of course, that person being Nicole. And so it's awesome because for the Blue Lanterns, it's a time of celebration. It's a time to kind of look around and say, this is what we've been striving for all this time, is to find Adara, and then in turn, see if we can't find a way to use that energy to bolster the power of the Blue Lanterns, or at the very least, to find a way to consolidate that energy into ourselves. So it is kind of cool because in this moment, Adara begins to sort of analyze the various people who were here. She analyzes Larfleeze, for example. It says, your parents are still alive and your parents still miss you. Why do you choose to live this life of a Orange Lantern where you're so full of a void that can never truly be filled? If you let this go and you go back to your family, you'll find the life that you've been searching for. With Hal Jordan, it's a lot more interesting. The idea is that she analyzes Hal Jordan and says, you are filled with hope, but for whatever reason, you won't allow yourself to feel it. You won't allow yourself to be full of hope. You're afraid of hope. Why are you afraid of hope? Now, if I'm going to be honest with you guys, I would look at Hal Jordan, I would say he's afraid of hope because of what could happen. Hal Jordan at one point was hopeful. He was a guy who was full of hope, full of beautiful tomorrows, and who knows what'll happen and who knows what the future will bring, but it'll definitely be brighter than today. And then Coast City was destroyed, and then he was possessed by the Parallax entity, and then he wiped out all the Green Lanterns and killed all the Guardians of the Universe except one. And then he waged war against the entirety of the DC Universe, crushed Superman, defeated all the superheroes, and tried to blink reality out of existence. And him being possessed by Parallax is predicated on the idea that he lost what he loved. He lost hope, basically. And so if he goes back to being hopeful, allowing himself to care about things again, he makes himself prey for Parallax. And that's what's kind of interesting because while we end up having, Adara who looks to be converting Hal Jordan into a Blue Lantern, suddenly the two of them are severed. The two of them are separated. And the reason why is because they're met by the arrival of the Flash. And the Flash simply says, we have to talk about the friends that you're spending time with. We have to talk about the people that you're keeping company with, and we have to talk about that right now. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.